Mitchell Thomas, welcome to the sisterhood.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, okay, this is so fun. So, the listeners don't know because our last names are different, but
Right.
Thomas is my maiden name and Mitchell is my brother. So, this is an especially exciting episode for me because this is his first appearance on the sisterhood.
And I'm honored to be on the podcast and to be talking with my sister. It's pretty awesome.
You're on the sisterhood.
Yeah.
You have a whole gaggle of sisters listening.
I have
This
two
is your-
I have two older sisters and I have three daughters, so it is my destiny to be surrounded by awesome women. So this is really fun.
No, you have always been the best. Mitch, I was just saying, because we just went on vacation together and we actually did a food trip where we stayed for a few days with our original family. So FOO stands for Family of Origin, and we stayed. And when I got back, my kids were like, how was it? How did it go? And I said, Mitch is literally the easiest person to be around, and he makes everything funny and everything fun, and yet he's thoughtful and kind. But if my mom's getting stressed out, he just says something really funny and we all laugh and we move along. I mean, it's just, that's Mitch's role in the family. It always has been. So,
Yep. Third child, the clown.
Third child, I know.
The theater person.
Well, I feel like we could camp there, but that's not the topic for the day.
No. Well, and Mitch, you just said theater person, but you haven't always been a theater person. In fact, if I can brag on you just for a minute, Mitch grew up as kind of the soccer star in our town. He held every record and actually still holds some records, I believe, in our city. And
I hope so. I need to check on those to see if they're still...
you better that should go up in your office somewhere. But he was the true athlete. In fact, he was recruited by the University of Washington to play Division I soccer, which is like at the elite level. He was recruited by European teams. My parents didn't let him go move to Europe when he was in high school, but he actually was recruited for that. And so Mitch, tell us a little bit about how, as an athlete, and really you were the athlete, you weren't the theater kid.
Yep.
So how did theater intersect into your world and what happened?
Yeah. Well, I just want to damp down a little bit to talk about European clubs. I think, there was maybe like into a training thing, but anyway, yeah, it was kind of my dream going to the University of Washington and playing at that level. And I traveled all around the country and played against a lot of players that actually ended up making it on the US national team. So that was like everything that I thought I wanted. And it was so fun, actually. It was a dream come true. But something I noticed when kind of during my second year of college was I started to burn out. I wasn't playing as well. I wasn't as interested. And that was a really scary time of my life because I was so defined by that role. I never really thought about what I wanted to major in. It was just kind of like play Division I soccer. I thought maybe broadcast journalism or who knows. And so, I actually ended up studying abroad in Spain and kind of taking a break and going by myself somewhere where I wasn't defined by all the people around me. And you were talking a little bit about my role in the family, and I love that role, but it's definitely a kind of defined spaces we have in our lives, right? And so it was a real gift and blessing for me to be away and to realize, wow, this was something I loved to do and I was really good at, but there are a lot of other things I want to do, including theater and music and literature and poetry. And so I just had that 6 months as kind of a vision quest time in my life to kind of figure out who I was now as, a 20-year-old rather than the 17-year-old kind of living out what he thought he was supposed to do. And so I had a big dramatic shift. I ended up transferring schools. I ended up getting involved in the theater program and doing every single play that I could. I ended up double majoring in English and theater. And so, I work with college students now. And so some people come to me and say, oh, is it too late? And I say, no, absolutely not. I mean, I had an about face. And of course, post-college, people can do that as well. But I really had very little experience and then just jumped into it. And that quickly became my profession. Ended up going back to graduate school and immersing myself in that. But so I still play pickup soccer. I love playing. I love being outside and all of that. But yeah, I kind of found my vocation and I found my kind of true passion midway through college as I discovered it. So that was an exciting and yeah, big shift for me at that period of my life.
I can see how going from being an athlete into theater, because it's kind of an embodied activity where you're using your physical body in that space. So you could have gone dance. You chose, maybe you danced, I don't know. But theater, how did it feel to you as you were a young adult trying it out? What about it was appealing to you?
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a great point. I mean, I in my life actually, and we can talk maybe more about some of this later, but I've actually gravitated toward more physical forms of theater. There are, sometimes people think of theater in a very particular way, but of course there's lots of genres and approaches and styles and types of work and audiences. And so that actually has been a big part of my life as a theater artist. I mean, I teach a theater class called The Body in Theater, that's really approaching it through the physical form. So I think no doubt my background, informed who I was and who I am. Just like all the different kind of strands of our lives feed into who we are as creative people in the world. And so that's also something that I like to talk to students about, or that I like to think about, is when I, eventually found my way on my path, I saw in the rearview mirror all these strands of my life kind of coming together in a really powerful way, where I felt God calling me into a new way of being in the world. And at the time, I didn't know all these things were going to meet each other because they seemed like really different things. So that's something that has been powerful for me to reflect on and notice. It's not always something I'm aware of in the moment. And so kind of looking back on that, it's easier to trace. But in terms of the physicality of theater, I mean, sometimes we think about like a psychophysical loop, where our psychology informs our body and our body informs our psychology. And so call that kind of like the psychophysical continuum. Sounds fancy, but if you think about it in our lives, that we really feel that, right? Our mental health, our spiritual health affects our body. And then also what's going on with our bodies will oftentimes creep itself into how we think and how we feel. And so that's something that broadly is kind of looked at and developed in the theater. And so as theater artists, we're usually trying to work on ourselves as like people, as neutrals, as well as the craft of, say, creating a character or creating a performance. So I find that kind of endlessly fascinating because there's so many connections to whether it's yoga or neuroscience or psychology or, all these different connections that play into, telling stories, the human body. So it's a lot of fun.
I really like that you drew out the physicality of theater. And, we're in a series called Faith and Art, and we're really looking at how these different aspects of art can influence our faith. And so, I mean, today, as we're looking at theater and it is physical and it is psychological, there's kind of both components. Well, for a lot of the arts, that's true. So how do you think theater is actually uniquely positioned to explore these deeper themes of faith and meaning and humanity?
Well, that's a big question, $1 million question. And I think, I think one of the things that makes theater so powerful is it is embodied, right? And it is visceral. And there is an energy exchange between audience and performers. That's also what can make it dangerous, right? And why the church and the performing arts in particular have had, a little bit of a fragile, fraught relationship over the ages, is because it's that thing that does make it so powerful that makes it kind of difficult. And so that's just a double-edged sword, two sides of the same coin. I like to joke that, like, for example, in terms of the human body, we can read about nudity, or we can even look at a painting of the Garden of Eden with nude bodies, but the minute I direct my all nude like play in Eden, I'll be fired for Westmont because it's just different, right? The like visceral, embodied, live kind of interface. And so, but I do think, thinking broadly about storytelling and the power of telling stories, it's as old as humanity. Gathering around a fire and telling a good story, talking about our day and the hunt or whatever it was. And so I do think there's something like deeply rooted in what it is to be human, where we understand and we make meaning through stories. And I think theater in particular, there's no one, can doubt we're in kind of a polarized, difficult time. And there's a woman that I love. Her name is Anna DeVere Smith. She's a director and a Christian, and she was on West Wing for a long time. And she talks about, if you go into a community and find out what can't be talked about, that's a good place to start making art. And I love that, because there is something about theater or fine arts or poetry, music, however you want to define it, where there's enough of a space between us and the product that sometimes that can soften our positions, and we can really listen and develop some empathy for the other in a way that sometimes conversation can't do. We have triggers of certain words or certain issues that make it impossible for us to kind of get beyond our own defenses. And I think that theater, stories, parables, right, can open those things up to us, and help at least us make a little bit of progress toward developing that empathy and compassion for someone who might think or be different than who we are.
Last week we had on Karen Swallow Prior, and she talked about literature and the idea of journeying with a character and how that can teach us lessons, or we can come to our own conclusions based on the character's experience. And I was thinking today about what's the difference between literature and theater, because both are telling stories, often narratives. But you mentioned that dynamic between those on stage and those who are watching.
Mm-hmm.
And as a writer, I think of books as being a direct communication between the writer and the reader. And obviously every reader is going to read the words and interpret them with their own filters. But it's like with theater, there's this whole different dynamic of the writer and the cast and the audience. And sometimes the writer and the cast have some overlap, but usually not, I would think.
Right? Usually not.
So you're interpreting their story in your own way, and then the audience is doing their interpretation, and it's a group experience. So how do you see theater entering that space and offering something unique that other storytelling methods don't offer?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. And if you talk to any writer, they would say, whether it's screenwriting or playwriting, it's a very different enterprise than someone who is a novelist or a poet. And you have to be willing to collaborate and kind of let go of your work on some level, right? In a way that the novelist doesn't. So a lot of playwrights are by nature more interested in that collaboration and them creating, let's say, half of the thing, but then it's filled in by the director and the designers and the cast and then the audience. So it's a really different thing. And sometimes, Hollywood's famous for changing the vision of the screenwriter. That's a particularly, I think, hard for them sometimes. But hopefully they're getting paid really well by Hollywood to do that. But yeah, you're right. I mean, theater is so much a communal effort, right? Even if I'm doing a one-person show, I mean, I still have my director and I have the designers and I have the stage manager and I have all these other people. And film, of course, is, there's so many people working on we just saw In the Heights last night, my wife and my daughter, and just reading looking at who contributed to making this film. It's just staggering, right? And I think that's part of what I am drawn to. I love being in community with a community for something. And so that bond between, we talk about cast bonding and crew bonding, but also, the audience who are no longer strangers because we're really sharing something together. Something about that live interchange that I think is really unique. Even film, is kind of made by strangers for strangers. And a lot of people come into a film set for a day and they're out. Whereas a theater performance has this process of the ensemble making it and devising it, and then this extended couple of hours with an audience where it really changes depending on how that relationship emerges. So I do think that makes theater very, very distinct as an experience, and has, for all the gifts that film and novels and poetry and music and fine arts have, theater, I think, does have its own particular energy and experience that is really valuable. And I love that. But you have to be a collaborative person to want to go into the live theater.
Well, what's interesting is that this podcast may not be in existence if Alex and I had not stood next to each other in the theater.
Nice.
That is true. And I really didn't want to forget that point today. So thank you for bringing it up.
Because do you remember, Mitch, that we stood next to each other in a chorus line, our college production of a chorus line?
That's right.
And it was the hours and hours of rehearsal, like you were just talking about. It was the cast building community. And for Alex and myself, it was the two of us building community in that moment. And look at what's happened years later because of that initial connection on the stage. So, that's pretty cool. That's like a great example of what you just said.
It's true. And I think, for me, when we talk about, because, I talk to students and prospective parents and think about this all the time in terms of what does it mean to be a theater maker who is Christian, right? What sets apart a program at a Christian college versus a professional theater or another liberal arts college? And I think sometimes it's hard to always articulate oftentimes when people think about what is Christian art, they think about the what, right? The product itself, right? Like, what's the story? And of course that plays into it. But for me, a more interesting question, or perhaps a deeper question, is like the how and the why. Like, how do we interact with our cast, right? How do we view our audience? Why are we making the work that we are making? What is underlying our desire to tell these stories and to engage as individuals, as a creative team, and with our community? And of course, that can mean, let's say, explicitly Christian content. But in my case, oftentimes, that's not what it means. It means that I'm trying to make really excellent work because I think Christians should make excellent work. And I think a lot about what it means to be a Christian friend and leader and director and professor. But not necessarily in a way that the audience will always know what that was. And so that's an important kind of point for me in terms of building community and leading with love and generosity and compassion in our work as artists and our lives as people, that model that in terms of how we approach our work and our careers. Because some people that graduate from our college are called to work in churches and work in making films that have particular kinds of Christian audiences. And others are called to just be really excellent designers and writers and actors and theater makers in the world, working with a whole range of companies and audiences. And so for me, that's a really important tent to create space for different people and where they find their gifts, all under the idea of I'm being led in my life, called by God to make good work and to be in good relationship with people.
Well, and I just love that you said that and that you exemplify that to me, because a lot of people feel like artistic integrity and Christian theater don't hold hands with each other. They feel like Christian theater is kind of cheesy, so to speak, and a little bit like, I don't know, just glossed over, doesn't explore some of the deeper nuance of life. And that's not you. Like, you actually do the opposite. You dive into the deep waters and you have high artistic integrity. And so I just really like this idea that actually they hold hands, and it doesn't have to be overtly Christian for someone to be engaging the theater in from a place of faith. And just like anything else, we bring, like Alex was saying, our own perspective wherever we go. And so we can be grappling with these themes of life and humanity from a perspective of faith, no matter what we're watching or doing. And like you said, most often it's not actually overtly Christian.
Yeah, and I think that, oftentimes people that are making that kind of work are being motivated by a really important motivation, which is they're trying to tell redemptive stories, right? They're trying to point to the light. They're trying to bring hope and love. And, I think your subtitle of this series was something around, Philippians 4, whatever is true and noble and right. And I think that that's such an awesome verse. And I think it can lead us into some dangerous territory as artists, because whatever is pure is a really complicated question as it relates to like being in the broken world, right? And so when I think people level fair criticisms against Christian storytelling or art, it can feel like, oh well, it's black and white, right? And evil is naughty and good prevails, and it doesn't sometimes feel like it lives in the same world that we are all living in. And then people who aren't experiencing things just getting buttoned up at the end of their lives, that are living in some really tragic and broken personal or communal circumstances, feel left out of that story. And so I think there's absolutely a place for explicitly Christian or redemptive endings, happy endings. I love happy endings. And
You know, I
comedies.
do too.
Yeah, I know you do. Hallmark. But I think it's also important. Some artists are called to reflect more the broken world that we're living in, and open up stories that we don't always hear, and kind of give compassion to people and to audiences by helping us see some of the fragilities or the darker side of what it is to be human. And that's complicated. That's complicated terrain. But to me, that is getting into the nuances and the more sophisticated understanding of how do we balance being artists who are also called to be people of faith.
How would you suggest someone, I don't know, practice being a better audience member? And if most of our listeners are probably going to be involved in the theater as an audience member rather than a cast member, maybe somebody will be inspired to try on a costume, go to the tryouts. But a lot of people may just be inspired to go to a show that they hadn't done. And now we're more able to than we were a year ago to go and be part of a live audience. Mm-hmm. How would you coach someone to maybe go past their comfort zone a little bit in that?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And I think, most people end up being, audience members, and we don't need to be experts, but we can develop ways to become kind of more informed and better audience members in anything. One of the things that I do with my students is especially my beginning acting class, which is there's one for majors and minors, but then I also teach one that is for general education students. So this might be the theater class they take, right, in their 4 years, their arts class. And I very intentionally bring them to about 5 to 7 live productions during a semester and make those productions all really different styles and approaches and kind of types of theater. Because oftentimes we think about, whatever it is we may have been exposed to, musical theater in our high schools or Christmas Carol at our local community theater or whatever it might be that we have in our DNA or our lives. Some people have never been to the theater. My hope with students is they walk away with a much broader horizon and understanding of the forms that theater can take. And just like anything, we're going to have our preferences, but by just being a little intentional about, let's say, a mixed diet of things that we participate in as audiences, there are lots of, in some cities, there are some really nice big regional theaters that offer some great productions, but then there are sometimes smaller theater companies that maybe are doing more risky or new playwrights. Regional theaters are oftentimes really trying to balance, you know, kind of butts in seats, crowd pleasing work in order to be a more sustainable economic model. So some of the more adventurous or new work might be happening at some of the smaller theater companies in your community. And they're always looking for new audience members, and they would be very happy to have people. So I think, yeah, just mixed diet and, enjoy what you enjoy, but also see if you can cultivate a little bit of curiosity about things that maybe at first glance you wouldn't always go to.
Yeah, and I think universities obviously are a fantastic place for that because
Yes,
I would love to just be in your town where I could just come to every one of yours, So just
it's
really
true.
seeking out the university sector too.
And that's one of the blessings of working at a college university where, of course we want our shows to be full and audiences to come, but we're not so completely driven by the bottom line in the way that professional theaters are, which are so reliant on both donors, right? So they can't do anything that's going to upset the people that are giving them lots of money, and on ensuring that audiences come, because usually about 50 to 60% of a theater's budget is through box office sales. And so it's precarious for them, especially with COVID, but it's always precarious. So yeah, I think that's a great point, Krista, that colleges, universities can be a great resource for people that have access to it.
So what would you say as you look back on your experience going to theater? Has there been a play that really shifted something in you or changed the way you were thinking about something? I would just love to know, even personally, how you've been impacted by the theater.
Yeah. Well, that's such a huge, huge question. And I feel like about 5 or 6 pieces pop into my head because, I feel like I've been, like I was talking about early on in my life, just in terms of really knowing that this was something I loved to do. Um, my mom was a career counselor, and sometimes people would joke like, "Your son became an actor? Like, what kind of career counselor were you?" And they were always so supportive about following your passion and figuring out, that your path would unfold itself if you're really coming alive in the world and finding where that met, a career. So I'm really grateful for that. But I would say when I first came to Westmont, there was a play, this was back in 2005. And it was called The Saint Plays, and it was written by this playwright named Eric N. A series of short plays based on the lives of the saints, and um, and he came and we commissioned him to write a new play. So I directed kind of 4 short plays, and he did these writing workshops, and he sat with the students and with me, and he's a very avant-garde. He calls them kind of exploded biographies of the saints, and so kind of non-traditional theater in a lot of ways. And for me, I just found the combination of making new work, working with a living playwright, engaging with students in these really profound stories, but also doing it in a way that felt so artistically free and generative. That for me was like, wow, I can do this kind of thing with my life. Like I can work at a Christian college and produce this kind of work. Like, where has this been all my life? Because I was working in the professional kind of actor for hire before. And while that was exciting, and sometimes really fulfilling, it wasn't kind of an experience where I felt kind of all aspects of my being really coming alive. And so that was a moment for me where I felt like, wow, I'm really meant to be here and I'm really excited about what I get to do. Um, so yeah, I would say that was the one that I would say took me into the next kind of phase of my life as an artist.
It's really powerful. It's so, and I think about those students that got to be a part of that. I mean, it's just incredible.
Yeah, and that was a special production. There's still a number of students from that show that I connect with all the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's been fun for me is that you bring a lot of, I mean, the theater, often people just think it's what happens on stage while the actors are performing. But actually, there's so much to theater that is not just memorizing lines and acting. It's all these practices and all of these, and some, I feel like you nodded to that at the beginning with even just physical movement, but you have brought some things into our family that have been super fun. And let me just describe one. So around the campfire in the summer, when we're at the lake cabin, Mitch has us all doing this thing called the sound circle. And everyone would think we were crazy who walked up, but literally like everyone like does a sound and then everyone else joins in with their own sound. I mean, things that are so funny, Mitch has us doing all the time.
It's optional. I'd like to point out that's optional for people to participate in.
But it's super fun and we just love the energy and some of the things that Mitch brings to the table. And so you're bringing theater practices to us and it's really vibrant. And so when you think about some things that people can even do, theater practices, do you have any suggestions?
Well, that is a very, people are going to have different thresholds of what they're interested in. But so let's go back to the very beginning of Western theater, right? Where the Greeks in 500 BC, there was this idea that at that point, theater was masked, right? And people would say that in putting on a mask, we're able to take off other ones in our lives, right? The mask of what it is to be a mom or a daughter or my personality, right? I'm able to move into something because I am masked. I'm able to actually soften some of the things that I wear in my day-to-day lives. And that's an interesting concept for me as it relates to just the spirit of play that I think is really important in the theater. We talk about theater being a serious but playful discipline. And my daughter, Gwyneth, who, is 10 years old, she's really good at just playing, right? And just, okay, I'm in this world in an instant. And as adults, we get less conditioned to that. And it's like, is it okay? Am I going to look dumb? I might throw out my back, like whatever it might be. And so I do think, whether it's getting up and doing charades. I mean, we love playing charades with my dad because he'll all of a sudden do some crazy thing that like no one has ever seen Bappa act like a swan before. And there's something that's just so fun. And I think healing for the audience or the family, but also for someone like my dad to be able to express themselves physically in a way that they typically do not. So whether that's a game, a role-playing thing, making up a story, a musical sound game, whatever it might be, I think to provide some opportunities for us to be playful together and to maybe be a little strange together can help break down some of what we call our socialized selves. So when we're working with students, I'm like, yeah, walk around the room, and they'll all walk at like a very kind of normal rate. And I'll say, this is your socialized self. And I'm really not interested in your socialized self. So start to move faster. And then pretty soon they're all moving through the space and the energy is changing and their patterns, their physical and energetic changes are happening. And that's their unsocialized self, which is much more capable of play and discovery than the kind of cool or collected or put together versions of ourselves we like to show the world.
Oh, it's so true. I love that. And I was even thinking about improv. And so, like, how could even a family incorporate a little mini improv into their summer vacation?
Yeah, I mean, if people just, there are lots of really great, simple improv exercises. And so, there's a game where, two people start a story and then anyone in the circle can call freeze and you're in the physical shape of some kind and then they freeze and you tap one person out and that person goes away and you take their shape and then you start a new story based on that shape that's totally different than what came before. And that's a spirit of improv, or the most important rule of improv is saying yes, or yes and. So he's saying yes to whatever your partner offers. And I feel like that's such a great spirit, right, for a family to have, yes and, like receiving the offering and then offering something back. So for people that are interested in, there's you can Google great improv games. There's lots of community colleges that offer adult education in improv or beginning acting class or theater appreciation class, that are not for people who are going back to college, but just, to do something once a week or, in some sort of weekend intensive that, cultivates that spirit of play and that spirit of kind of finding your childlike spirit again. And then seeing where that shows up in our day-to-day lives. It's good to be adults. We need to be adults in a lot of ways, but I think we can soften and invite that spirit into more than we maybe expect.
Mm-hmm. I'm just remembering, I went to a non-COVID party. So it was like a few weeks ago. The people are starting to have parties again. And I saw somebody I hadn't seen for a few years. And he said, well, I don't know if you've heard, I've gotten into theater. And I just don't hear that very often from people in their 40s. And I hadn't heard that. And now I'm feeling bad that I didn't ask him more questions about it. I think I just kind of froze, like, what? Who does that? So I am going to go back and find out more. But it's a good reminder that we can. It's not that there's an age cap on this. In fact, I think it's something that people, when they retire, like to do. And so this is a lifetime art that's not dependent on us necessarily being super fit. And we can age into it. And it can be something that we can participate in lots of ways, from set design to costume making to being on stage. I just think that's really fun. It's a fun thing that I don't think of often, even though it's part of my past, as we have stated.
Absolutely. And I bet it'll come back at some point. But my wife, Sarah, her Aunt Ruth, just started taking improv or stand-up comedy at the age of 75. And she's trying to get on America's Got Talent. We actually went to a Zoom stand-up comedy. I wouldn't necessarily recommend Zoom stand-up comedy as your starter kit, but if Aunt Ruth can do it, then anybody can. And I just have so much admiration for her. But yeah, even as we get older, sometimes we're less, especially men, but anybody in their 20s, 30s, we can be really ego driven, right? We can care a lot about what people think about us. And that's, that's pretty hostile environment for our like playful, unsocialized spirit. And so as we get older, I think sometimes we care a little bit less, right? Like what that person thinks, or what are they going to think if I do something crazy? Like, it doesn't really matter. They can think what they want to think. And that's actually, I think, a good step. So as we get older, we might even be, more ready to take this on than we were maybe 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, and I think what's really been special about your role in our family is you've given people permission to do that, to be playful from a young age. I mean, I remember being around the campfire and we were doing improv stories. So not where actually we were acting it out, but where you would start a story and then the next person would pick up. And it was literally like every single time my boys would turn it into Star Wars. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I
And I
do.
remember you were just like, oh, here we go again. It's back into Star Wars. And that would just kill the story. But what I loved about that is from a young age, you were teaching my kids and giving me permission to have fun and to explore. And even though it always went to Star Wars, we kept doing it and we kept practicing. And I think the more you do it, the more comfortable you become. And so that, I think, is such a gift that we can lead in that for our communities.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that's important for me, and like we were talking about earlier, I'm a probably physical actor and teacher. I have to sit on my, try not to jump up and show people how I want them to act, because I want to play every role in the play. I'm one of those people. So, but on day one of acting classes, like I'm up there and I'm doing everything that I'm asking the students to do. And I'm looking foolish and I'm being playful and I'm doing it first. And so I think you're right, modeling, whether it's in a family or in a relationship or with friends or whatever, I think that does. It breaks the ice. And it also models like, this can be a little bit of a time of doing something together that isn't our usual patterns. And that's actually a really fun and exciting and bonding thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mitch, this has been so fun for me. Do you have any last words you want to encourage people with?
I guess the last thing I want to say is sometimes when we think about, let's say, the arts, theater, film, photography, painting, music, fine arts, in our world, I think sometimes we can view that through a lens of like the professional, right? Like, oh, well, I did theater in high school, or I loved this thing, or I made music, but like, I'm not going to do that for my job. And so then people stop because they think the only way to express themselves is for somehow that to be a career. So actually, one of the books I put in the notes is this book called The Artisan Soul by a guy named Erwin McManus. He's a pastor in LA. I love this book. And he talks about just the artisan soul and how we can bring our creative spirit to whatever we're doing. And so I think probably for a lot of your listeners, it's not necessarily, I mean, hopefully some people will get into improv and join some theater troupes. But it also could just be like, what is something that I feel creative in? And how have I been holding myself back from that pleasure and feeling that sparkle and like that rush of bringing my creative faculties, God-given creativity, to whatever it is, right? Ice skating or podcasting or cooking or creating parties or writing, whatever it might be. And so I think that that's an important thing to break down this idea that we somehow have to be good at it, or that we have to be somehow making money or professional at what we do to live a creative life and to expand our creative faculties and potential. So that's something that I think is good for people to hear. You don't need to be good at it. You don't need to be a professional to kind of, follow your curiosity a little bit and have that give you some life.
Yeah, and as a coach, one of the things that I camp in a lot is what makes an abundant, meaningful life. And actually, what you just named is the second thing that makes an abundant, meaningful life. And that is where you nurture your unique giftings in the world. And so when we're not nurturing, if we're just working in our job and we're not nurturing some of these other places that we are gifted, pieces die in us. That's actually a part of an abundant life, is nurturing those. And so I just like that even visual of like watering those seeds and letting them bloom. Mm-hmm. Well, thanks, Mitch. This has been so much fun for me. I could talk to you all day.
Well, thanks for having me. And I'm going to listen to the rest of the series and hear what these other artists have to say, because I think that'll be a fun collage.
Okay. Well, thanks, Mitch. Have a great day. And we wish you the best. Your students are seriously the luckiest at Westmont.
Well, thank you. All right.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.